Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Mary Habeck, who, although she hasn't appeared before here at Cantini, she has spoken at other history institutes of FPRI, and I think you're in for a real treat. Her area of expertise that she was trained in is European and American military history. She was trained at Yale, where she got her PhD and went on to teach for about 10 years. She's now teaching and writing on Al-Qaeda and ISIS at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, at Georgetown University and American University, and has her own consulting firm, Applied Grand Strategies, and is also a senior fellow of FPRI. She served on the Council of the Humanities at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and served briefly as a special advisor for strategic planning on the National Security Council staff. She's the author of a number of books and articles on Al-Qaeda, which is also the subject of her book in progress. How she got from German and Russian military doctrine to Al-Qaeda maybe is something she could tell you later on today. But anyway, please welcome Mary Habeck.
Being in government is not supposed to be a voyage of discovery, but in fact that's what it kind of turned out for me, and I'm happy to talk about how one goes from academia to government and the sorts of things I discovered about my own intellectual interests through the process of doing policy. Allow me to say just very briefly that one should not take seriously the stricture from Kissinger that you go into government with a whole lot of intellectual sort of weight, and you slowly use up that as you stay in government. I, in fact, found it an enriching sort of experience, and I learned just as much as I did doing my dissertation from 1 year in government. So I can highly recommend going into government as a voyage of self-discovery and as a way to get your postgraduate education. All right, today I'm going to be talking about the military and counterterrorism, and I'm going to be doing it without slides. So those of you who have been texting and checking your emails or actually perhaps want to take notes, because there will be no slide deck to back up what I'm going to be saying today. The biggest issue that one deals with when looking at counterterrorism is the loose way that we use the word terrorism today. We talk about nearly all the violence out there as being terrorism. We talk about terrorist attacks. We talk about terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, are those terrorist groups? Apparently. After all, we've had an entire war on terrorism. So the way that the term terrorism is used in ordinary speech is very different from the way that experts use it, or, by the way that the government and our legal system use those terms. There's very definite definitions for these things in the military, in our legal system, and in the government as a whole that have only some things to do with the ways that we use it in ordinary speech. And the distinctions between terrorism and other forms of irregular warfare are significant. Not because, let's tweak this definition so it sounds better. I have seen definitions of terrorism and of insurgency or counterinsurgency that are entire paragraphs, sometimes 2 or 3, obviously put together by committee, and with everything but the kitchen sink thrown in. And people look at it and say, what in the world is this good for other than just provoking arguments? And the truth is that definitions in this case matter because they have policy implications. They're not just about playing around with words. They actually, behind them, have a theory of victory, a theory of the enemy, and a theory of what kinds of strategies we should be following in order to defeat these guys. So there is a tremendous distinction, in fact, between terrorism and insurgency. Most experts would agree on this. But how do we go about understanding that distinction? Well, let me give you, first of all, the definition of terrorism as it's expressed in the US legal code, because there is an actual definition of terrorism in the legal code. It says that it is the unlawful use of force and violence against persons. This is how you know you're talking about legal people. Nobody else has persons in the entire world. Or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof. There's another, nobody ever uses it. In furtherance of political or social objectives. Now, having said that, you're immediately struck by the fact that this is very similar to the definition that we just got of insurgency. In fact, it's unclear what the distinction is from that definition. It seems like it's any violence in furtherance of some sort of political goal. Well, that's basically what we just heard that insurgency is. So that's a really unhelpful definition if you're trying to make a distinction between these two forms of violence. So what is the way that the people who do this every day, the experts, think about these two issues outside of a formal definition that actually does help us to understand what we should be doing in order to combat them? Well, the way experts think about this is that we're talking about a spectrum. On the one hand, the one end is terrorism, and on the other end is actually regular warfare. And in between are all sorts of forms of warfare that are usually called irregular warfare. And guerrilla warfare is somewhere in the middle, edging towards the regular warfare. And between regular warfare and the form of warfare called guerrilla warfare is something called hybrid warfare, which puts the two together. So it's a spectrum. Terrorism, guerrilla warfare, hybrid warfare, and on the far end, regular warfare. And they blend into each other. There's some neat lines at certain points, but they tend to blend into each other. And some of the neat lines matter quite significantly when it comes to policy prescriptions and how we should go about dealing with this set of issues. I've used the term, however, irregular warfare, and that also needs to have some kind of definition so you know what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about. And I'm going to give you my definition rather than the one written by a bunch of lawyers. My definition of irregular warfare is all forms of warfare that are not regular. It's actually the Webster Dictionary definition. If you go look it up, this is what Webster Dictionary. It's so simple, it's brilliant, right? Why? Because we actually understand regular warfare. We have really good definitions for regular warfare. Of all the forms of warfare out there, there's this little tiny circle that we call regular warfare that sort of pins off the entire world or universe of fighting and violence into what we believe is an understandable realm, a realm that we get, that we're very good at because it's how Europeans and Americans fight. It's our traditional style of warfare, actually. It's run with our rules. We call them international rules today, but originally they were European and American rules. And it pins off regular warfare from everything else, all the traditional forms of warfare, all the irregular kinds of fighting that people like the Native Americans engaged in. It pins them off from us and makes us special and different. This is our form of warfare, and it's called regular. Everybody else gets to be irregular. So guerrilla warfare, terrorism, all these other things fit into the irregular warfare definition. That's one of the bright lines, because we know regular warfare, one end of it, clearly defined. This is what we're talking about. On the other end is terrorism, and we also understand this in ways that help us to see how to fight them. Because terrorism, unlike insurgency, which we just talked about, is small, smaller than insurgencies. Those terrorist groups can be as small as 5 guys. ETA, the Basque terrorist group, towards its very end, was less than a dozen people carrying out terrorist attacks. So they're small. They can be very secretive and not want to actually recruit much, because their whole purpose is to coerce people, to disrupt, to force people through violence to do what they want. And they believe they need to be secretive sometimes about their own organization, who they are. They don't introduce themselves sometimes, or wear things over their heads so you can't tell who they are. They don't recruit widely as insurgent groups. And this is one of the key characteristics of them that we're going to talk about in a bit here, that makes them vulnerable to policies that insurgencies are not. Because they're small, they can't hold territory, whether they want to or not. They're simply incapable of doing so. And they can't impose a form of governance, however much they might want to. They're just incapable of doing it. They don't have enough people around to coerce others into doing what they want. And by the way, as their name suggests, they use primarily terrorist attacks as their method of violence, not guerrilla warfare. They're just not capable of carrying out guerrilla warfare. They're too small. So instead, they're using explosions and assassinations as their way of carrying out violence. Okay, all of that is a kind of a bright line because we've now separated it as well from the insurgency there in the middle, right? An insurgency is all of the reverse of those things. They're larger, they're not secretive, they recruit widely. Their whole concept is to impose governance, and they're attempting to do so. They're trying to hold territory. All of the reverse, basically, of what we've just said. But you can see that there can be a kind of a spectrum between the two, in which you might have a group that wants to be an insurgency, but just is having trouble recruiting people, so they're forced to just use terrorist tactics. In the case of the Maoist style of guerrilla warfare, he begins with terrorist attacks while you're creating your group, while you're winning over people to your side. This is the problem that Aaron pointed out of starting the insurgency. Mao dealt with this. He had a 7-stage plan for fighting a guerrilla war successfully. Most people think it's 3 stages. But that's because the first 3 or 4 stages were before you were public, before you were an insurgency. You were a terrorist group. You were just getting started recruiting. And you were primarily using terrorism in order to kill off the people you wanted to get rid of before you were strong enough to carry out your warfare against the state. So terrorism to insurgency is a spectrum. And one of the purposes of a counterinsurgency is to take an insurgency and push it back down that spectrum until it is nothing but a terrorist group. But why would you want to make it into a terrorist group? Because terrorist groups are vulnerable to a whole set of tactics and techniques that insurgencies in general are not. That is, there are policies that you can use against a terrorist group that just will fail against an insurgency. And the biggest policy, the biggest way that you can attack them is through attrition, straight up attrition. That is killing or capturing the terrorists. Now that makes sense. If you only got 5 guys, or even 50 or 100, you can count them, then you can imagine setting up a chart and saying, putting X's through names, and eventually you go all the way to the end and that's the end of it, because they can't recruit widely. Once you go through those 5 or 50 or 100, the war is over. So attrition, killing or capturing, is something that everybody has as part of their counterterrorism toolkit. On the other hand, with an insurgency, simply killing or capturing will not end the problem. As Aaron said, this is a well-known statement amongst experts on this problem, you really can't kill your way out of this problem. That's insurgency. Now, I would say that this is half right. You really can't kill your way out of this problem if you have any moral sense at all. Because, in fact, the Russians/Soviets have killed their way out of insurgency 4 out of 5 times in the last 150 years. All right? So they fought a 50-year insurgency in the Caucasus during the 19th century against a people known as the Circassians. How many of you have heard of the Cherkash or the Circassians? The reason the rest of you have not heard their name is because the Russians were successful in killing about 2/3 of the entire population and pushing the vast majority off into the Ottoman Empire, where they made it their problem. They did exactly the same thing against the Basmachi during the 1920s and 30s, successfully pushing Tajiks and Uzbeks into Afghanistan, where they shifted the population in Afghanistan. And they attempted to do the same thing against the Pashtu in their war, the Afghan war, during the 1980s, pushing millions of Pashtu into Pakistan, where it could become the Pakistani problem and maybe destabilize an old enemy. The fact that after the Russians got involved, millions of Syrians are suddenly pushed into an enemy known as Turkey is no coincidence. It's actually part and parcel of their counterinsurgency methodology. So I don't want to make it sound as if attrition never works. But if you have any moral sense at all, you shouldn't do it. There are other ways of doing this. Population-centric vision of counterinsurgency works just as well, and it makes friends forever instead of enemies forever. Unless you think I'm sort of exaggerating here, one of the main al-Qaeda envoys that was sent off to fight with the Chechens in 1995 was a guy named Ibn Khattab. His background was Cherkash. The reason he wanted to go back and fight was because he was Circassian, and his family still remembered the way they'd been treated by the Russians, and he wanted to go back and get some revenge. So this concept of using attrition as a form of counterinsurgency will generally fail, but when it comes to counterterrorism, it can actually generally succeed. It was the main way that people dealt with all of those terrorist groups known as Red This and Red That during the 1970s and 80s. How many of those Red Army, Red Action, Red so on and so forth groups remained after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Hardly any of them. But many of them had already been dealt with in the 70s and 80s through a combination of kill and capture. Here's the other thing that dominates counterterrorism. The vast majority of the work is done by law enforcement with a lot of intelligence. So as with counterinsurgency, this is one of the things they share, you need to have a lot of intelligence. But law enforcement is a little bit up-armored, law enforcement is what I call it, can be enough. You don't need, in general, with an internal problem, to engage the military full-time, just bits and pieces. So law enforcement, the FBI, they're the ones that are in general charged with the problem of counterterrorism in general. But the military does have the role, as we're going to talk about in a bit. And there's a third piece here that is also quite different from counterinsurgency, and that is hardening your targets, making them more difficult to attack. That sort of defensive vision does not generally play a role when it comes to counterinsurgency, but it plays a really big role when it comes to counterterrorism. Now, the differences between them explain why you have law enforcement being charged with this problem, because you don't have the level of violence either when it comes to counterterrorism that you do with counterinsurgency. Nor do you have the sophistication on the part of the fighters to carry out things like hit-and-run attacks or large-scale battles on the part of the terrorists. So you're able to depend, by and large, on things like the FBI or Homeland Security in order to deal with the terrorist problem. So what role can the military play when it comes to this sort of issue? Well, in general, the role that they play, and especially for the United States, is abroad, not in the homeland, in general. They, after all, are the ones who can kill or capture when it comes to a terrorist group that is striking us from a global location rather than within the United States. The FBI just doesn't have the reach necessary in order to kill, capture. And often, we're talking about terrorist groups that are engaged in war zones. It would simply be too dangerous for the FBI to go over there and attempt to kill or capture somebody in Libya, for instance, or Somalia, or Afghanistan, and certainly Syria and Iraq. Now, how do they go about doing this is a little bit different as well than what we would usually see in the homeland. They use things like, well, primitive drones like cruise missiles during the 1990s, and today they use things like drones. This is just the concept of attrition, sort of high technology version, right? But there's also capturing going on. Many of these war zones, we have high-level targets who are captured, taken prisoner, and used as sources of intelligence. So capturing does occur. It used to occur much more frequently, and we used to have a special prison, obviously, to put all of these guys for the war on terror off in Cuba. The raids that are used for some of these kill-capture missions are also something that are the province exclusively of the military, and it's here that SOF, that is Special Operation Forces, are the ones who are generally given this task. So special operators will be carrying out most of this action to kill or capture. A premier example of this is obviously the UBL raid, what everybody calls the UBL. That is the Bin Laden raid into Abbottabad, right? But this is just one example of many that has occurred repeatedly throughout the entire war on terror. There's a secondary role that the military can play, and that is disruption. Disruption is important because what you're doing is not just killing or capturing in order to attrit the enemy, but also to disrupt plots. And a lot of this disruption is carried out through specific kinds of raids, specific kinds of drone attacks. When you know that there is going to be some sort of attack on the United States, you're disrupting their plotting and their planning. Some of these raids, obviously, or disruption that occurs is in war zones, like Iraq and Afghanistan. But sometimes it's in places like Yemen, where we're technically not at war, but you might hear that there's a plot, people planning a specific group that's been put together to carry out the terrorist attack, and you therefore have to do something in an urgent way, and only the military can be charged with this, so off they go to disrupt it. The third way that the military is used is collecting intelligence. Now, obviously, there are an awful lot of people in the IC, and especially in the NCTC, that's the sort of premier place where all of this data is collated, analyzed, put together into reports in order to figure out how to disrupt lots of these plans and plots and to kill or capture the terrorists. But the militaries also play a role, various bits and pieces of the military also play a role in collecting intelligence. Some of it is through killing and capturing people. You capture some guy, you have an interrogation, and he gives up information that ends up having or playing a vital role in taking down other terrorists. One of the examples of this that we know about is a guy named Abu Yunus al-Muratani. Abu Yunus al-Muratani was a high-level plotter, planner, whatever you want to call him. You want to give him some sort of title. He called himself Chief of External Operations for al-Qaeda. He was captured at some point in 2009, 2010, and he ended up in American custody and then in Mauritanian custody, where they actually had an interview of him and published an article detailing all the things that he knew about al-Qaeda. Now, we have no idea what he specifically might have told the United States. There's no data on that, but we do know what sorts of things he understood. He understood the entire organizational structure of al-Qaeda. He understood the entire organizational structure of their external operations and the terrorist plots and plans that they were planning on carrying out. So that capture must have had a tremendous impact on US operations. certainly has had a tremendous impact on our understanding of what is Al-Qaeda. But there are also documents that get captured. I was just talking to Alan about the Abbottabad documents. Everybody obviously knows that bin Laden was killed during that raid. What's less well known, by the way, is that his second deputy was also killed. He apparently had two deputies, Zawahiri and a guy named Abu Ahmed el-Kuwaiti. That was Abu Yunus al-Mauritani that told us that, by the way. He was also killed, but Zawahiri survived. At the same time, we also captured terabytes of documents, terabytes of information. I've had, obviously, some exposure to that because I spent a lot of time reading the released documents. There's hundreds that have been released so far in English. But back in November, the United States decided to release all the documents. They're now available on the CIA website. Hundreds of thousands of documents that give us a detailed look at the organizational structure and the plots and plans of Al-Qaeda. Hundreds of thousands. And some of those were, look like they were taken with a camera. They're sort of like PDFs that are like pictures, and a lot of it looks like they just carted away actual physical documents, and some of it, when you're talking about terabytes, must have come on hard drives. So that capture of all sorts of documents is also a vital piece that the military adds in the fight with terrorism. And finally, there's something that you're going to be, if you haven't talked about it already, probably you're going to be talking about training, foreign training, right? Is that later today, or is that yesterday? One of the roles, again, one of those very important roles that the military plays around the world in training others in the tactics and techniques necessary to combat terrorism and to combat insurgency. According to George Bush, back in 2001, we were already engaged in this in 60 different countries. 60 different countries working to improve the counterterrorism efforts, the fight against terrorism globally. I can only imagine that this must have increased tremendously since then, since there are more than 60 countries that are suffering from extremist violence today. And we can see some of the results of this just in startling and really encouraging ways. So one of the most important success stories is Indonesia. In 2002, 2003, we all heard about the attacks on Bali, the attacks in the Marriott hotels, but there were also internal attacks going on against ethnic and religious minorities, known as the Poso bus attacks, and a bunch of other community-based attacks that occurred. Indonesia, despite the fact that it practices a very moderate version of Islam, had in fact a terrible problem with extremism. And the United States got engaged and began training law enforcement and sort of a constabulary unit within the Indonesian government, known as Densus 88. Densus 88 would go on to have an unbelievable track record in finding, killing, and capturing terrorists, arresting as well, getting intelligence, and rolling up one cell after another. During the time that it was most active, the attacks on Indonesia went from an unbelievable number, probably hundreds a year, down to nearly non-existent. Now, recently has come back, but it suggests that the nature of the problem might be evolving in Indonesia. But Densus 88 had a tremendous impact on the problem of terrorism that Indonesia was facing. On the other hand, there have been some cases where the US has been less successful in attempting to work with other countries to convince them to fight terrorism. Now, some of this has to do with the fact that the terrorist attacks that are being carried out are not against the local host government. They're against others. So you think it's their problem and not yours. Some of it has to do with the fact that you have so much corruption that you're simply incapable of getting people to work with you. A third problem can be just a lack of capacity. Even with the best help and training in the world, you might not be able to raise their level of effectiveness so that they can deal with the problems that they're confronting or that the United States is experiencing because they're unable to deal with their own issues. One place that had a serious problem with this was Saudi Arabia. And probably you're saying, I'm so surprised to hear this. But if you take a look back in 2002, 2003, suddenly Saudi Arabia began to have a whole series of terrorist attacks. In 2004, there were hundreds of people that were being killed by these terrorist attacks. Most of them, however, were foreigners. Most of them were foreign workers or Americans or people that were not native Saudis. That's not to say that the Saudi authorities did not do everything they could at that point to try to take on the terrorists. You hear, or we all heard, about multiple raids that were carried out, kill or capture, basically, of terrorist cells. But it seemed to make no real dent in the problem. And from multiple sources, we know that one of the problems was they really didn't think it was a threat against them. They thought this was a problem for other people to deal with, and they misread the problem as being about the foreigners rather than about the extremists. So in the news reports in Saudi Arabia, they would say things like this. There was another attack by the whiskey smugglers amongst the foreigners in our capital today. Whiskey smugglers. Who were these people? Alcohol drinkers who were trying to smuggle in their alcohol, and they were just fighting each other. And that's what was causing these casualties amongst the foreign population or foreign workers in the country. Only once they began to believe, probably pressure from the US, that this was a problem for them and not just for outsiders, and by the way, that this was not about local groups, but was about extremists, did you see them taking this problem seriously and actually doing something about it? And the people who would have been working with them, by and large, would have been the military, helping them in counterterrorism tasks. So training foreign allies is one of the most important things that the military can do in order to not only deal with the problems that countries are facing internally, but also to disrupt plots and plans that might be aimed at the United States. Now, what is good about CT? Because it has a good side and has a bad side, and then I'm going to make some comments about the problem that we're facing today and whether we're making any headway in this problem. The good about CT is that it is a well-established set of tactics and techniques, well-known. People have been doing these sorts of things for decades, so they understand exactly what is necessary in order to disrupt these plots, to kill or capture, to gather the intelligence necessary, and so on and so forth. The second thing is that you can rely primarily on law enforcement. And this can make this really, really tempting for policymakers, right? You don't have to engage the military except just peripherally, on the edges. And when you do engage the military, it's just SOF or possibly drones, which is a really sort of low cost in terms of people lost as well as in terms of money methodology for dealing with the problem. So the third reason then for doing it is it has an excellent track record of success. I mentioned already there are all those groups called Red This and Red That from the 1970s and 80s, but in fact, if you just do an overall look at terrorist groups in recent times, they by and large can be dealt with successfully. They don't have the sort of ambiguous track record that you just heard about when it comes to insurgency. So we're Americans. We like to win. We like to have problems presented to us that we can solve. We don't like to be presented with challenges that don't have any solution. So one of the temptations to define something as a terrorist problem is because you can actually fix it, unlike insurgency. But what's bad about CT? Well, first of all, it requires really good cooperation between domestic and foreign agencies. And before 9/11, this was a joke. It was just completely lacking. I highly recommend the TV series on Hulu called The Looming Tower. It's fantastic on this issue. It details all the problems that the FBI had working with the CIA and vice versa. Just one word of advice on it. The people who were engaged had an agenda. They had a specific interpretation. And I'm going to sensitize you to that so that you'll know to kind of discount it or just take it into consideration when you're watching the series. Their agenda was to argue that the problem we're confronting with al-Qaeda is a law enforcement problem, and we should be killing, capturing, or arresting these guys, not engaging in wars. And they projected that back into the 1990s. The second thing they did was they really don't make the CIA people into real people. They're sort of cartoon figures. The FBI people, wow, do you get to know a lot about them. The CIA people, you know hardly anything at all, and they seem kind of cartoonish. So I'm just going to sensitize you to that. Neither one of those things may be or possibly is not true. They're certainly both debatable. Okay, so you have to have good cooperation. Well, since 9/11, though, you have NCTC, this National Countering Terrorism Center, and that should have answered the problem, right? No. Almost every piece of the IC has recreated their own countering terrorism center, sometimes under different names, in order to maintain their own expertise on these issues. So there's already developed some issues that NCTC and the 9/11 Commission did not completely solve. It also requires internally good cooperation with local communities. And this could be a real problem when you're dealing with something as sensitive as religion. So Muslim communities in the United States have reasons to be wary of the US government, and the US government has all of these borders, boundaries, lines that you're not allowed to cross whenever you're having conversations about religion. In addition, many of the things that are being done in order to subvert, as Aaron said, do not cross the line into illegal behavior. So how can you use law enforcement in order to deal with it? So even if you have good communication with a local community, they're telling you we have a problem, there's issues, can you deal with this guy? What can law enforcement really do if they haven't crossed the line into something illegal? I'll give you an example. In 2007, people noticed something very odd going on in Minnesota. There were all kinds of news reports of taxi drivers who were saying they would no longer carry alcohol in their taxis, or they didn't want dogs in their taxi, or they didn't want women riding alone in their taxis. And there was a huge debate that sprung up about Islam in America. Can we coexist? And my first question was, why isn't anybody asking about ordinary Islam in Somalia? Is this how ordinary Somalis practice Islam? And the answer is no. That's actually how the extremists practice Islam. It's not how ordinary Somalis practice their religion. They were, in fact, being radicalized. But beyond that, members of that community were, in fact, interacting with law enforcement and telling them we have a problem. These specific guys are radicalizing people in our community. And the response from law enforcement was, what have they done that's illegal? Nothing. So there's nothing you could do. Should we set up surveillance in houses of worship? Should you have informants sitting in on services? What's the correct answer in America? This creates a real problem in rooting out terrorism in our own country, let alone in a country where we don't understand the dynamics at all, right? It also requires, this is one of the other difficulties with counterterrorism, correct identification of the enemy and what the enemy is really up to. So today, most people would agree that ISIS is an insurgency. They took territory, they declared a state, they in fact began fighting in a kind of hybrid or even regular fashion. So people looked at that and they said, okay, we're dealing with an insurgency when it comes to ISIS, but what about al-Qaeda? Well, the problem is there is little elite and expert agreement on what constitutes al-Qaeda. Everybody calls it a terrorist group, But is it indeed? Well, it depends on what you think they are organizationally. If you read the official definition of the US government, put out in 2011 and never contradicted by this particular administration, Al-Qaeda consists of 3 pieces: a terrorist core, often Afghanistan, Pakistan, affiliates that are engaging in local insurgencies for local reasons, and people called adherents that are what everybody else in the world calls lone jihadis or lone wolves, right? That don't have any organizational connection at all with Al-Qaeda. They just get inspired by something on the internet and go off and carry out acts of terror. So defining it that way conveniently allowed the United States to have 3 separate strategies that meant we don't need to engage boots on the ground against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Because you see, if you just have a terrorist core off there somewhere in Afghanistan, Pakistan, you can use drones against them. If you have local insurgencies with local agendas that really don't have any connection to those guys, then you can count on your local partners and allies to deal with that problem, and we'll just support them. We don't have to engage directly. And the adherents can be dealt with entirely through law enforcement. You don't have to have the military engaged at all. But is that how Al-Qaeda defines itself? And the answer we know from Abu Yunus al-Muratani is no. Their organizational structure, in fact, shows no distinction between the core and the affiliates, which they call branches. Branch in the sense of a tree branch, not branch in the sense of a bank branch. And the word that they use to describe their relationship is udwiya, which means an organic relationship between your arm and the rest of your body. So to Al-Qaeda, all of those local insurgencies are in fact their field armies executing something they call the methodology, a plan that is based entirely on Mao. So according to Al-Qaeda, both their organizational structure and their strategic plan, they are in fact an insurgency and not a terrorist group. But we have some hint of that ourselves, because in August of 2016, somebody finally FOIA'd the numbers of people killed by drones. And drones are used to take out the terrorists. But I have to tell you what was originally said about the numbers in Al-Qaeda's core. In 2010, the head of NCTC gave an interview in which he said there are approximately 300 members of Al-Qaeda's core left. Approximately 300 members. So in August of 2016 then, we have sort of the final grade. How many of those 300 had the United States killed since the drone program had started? Any guesses? 60? 500? Actually, 2,500. So you've killed 2,500 of the 300. That's called, in the Soviet style, overfulfilling the plan, right? This suggests that you're not dealing, however, with a terrorism problem, because terrorist groups really can't replace themselves like that. They can't recruit widely, and basically they don't want to, mostly, because their purpose is not to create an on-the-ground insurgency. On the other hand, insurgencies do react like that. And in fact, Al-Qaeda has shown itself to be very resilient and not open to many of the techniques that we've been using that we call counterterrorism. So is this a full-blown insurgency that we're dealing with, or is this terrorism? We all want it, frankly, to be terrorism. It has an end. It has a solution. It has a set of tactics and techniques we well understand. Unlike counterterrorism or counterinsurgency, it doesn't seem like such an iffy proposition, right? Not even a 50-50. It's more like a 90-10 proposition of victory. If you read Audrey Cronin's book on this issue of how terrorist groups end. But the extremists themselves, through what they say, through what they're doing, through their military doctrine, and through their very organizational structure, are declaring themselves an insurgency. And whether we want to deal with that fact or not, I think it's something we must take into consideration. Thanks a lot.
questions now, and just turn your cards vertically so we can see who would like to ask. Right over there. Kimberly Kerr.
Kimberly Kerr from Wayne, New Jersey. I've been thinking a lot about what's been going on in the Sinai Peninsula. And when I've been reading articles, sometimes the action is considered counterinsurgency, and sometimes they refer to it as counterterrorism. So I was hoping, first of all, that you might be able to define which you think it is. And secondly, I mean, now Rex Tillerson isn't there anymore, but there had been talks that that the U.S. would be offering some support to Egypt, some continued support to Egypt. So my question is, are there any previous actions that can help inform U.S. and Egyptian governments' efforts in the Sinai Peninsula?
So first of all, that's a really terrific question, but it's a very deep question because one has to go back 40 years to catch some of the things that have been going on in Egypt. So Egypt has been dealing with a terrorism problem, not an insurgency problem, for decades. Zawahiri, when he was 16 years old, started his own group, the Jihad group, that carried out terrorist attacks. So, and then there was Gamal Islamiyah that also carried out terrorist attacks, and there were various splinters of both of those that carried out lots of terrorist attacks and didn't rise above terrorism during those decades. There was one specific group that attempted to do something like insurgency by going off into the desert and setting up the ideal state, and then carrying out attacks back into populated or settled Egypt. But they were a resounding failure because it turns out the desert is not a great place to hide. So that was basically the end of them. But so until you get to the 2000s, the problem that they've been dealing with in Egypt can be defined as terrorism. And the Egyptian government was very, very effective at dealing with it. They killed or captured thousands and had them in prisons, and had many of them actually repent and be sort of integrated back into society. But after that, things begin to shift because Al-Qaeda got engaged, especially after the Arab Spring. So there had been terrorist attacks carried out by small Al-Qaeda cells. In 2006, 2007, there were a few that were carried out, but they were quickly dealt with. But with the Arab Spring, you had this sort of upheaval within Egypt that allowed more than terrorism to develop. And we have captured documents, so we have some intelligence ourselves that help give us some insight into what precisely happened here to turn this from a terrorism problem to an insurgency. There are letters from a guy named Mohammed Jamal to Zawahiri, and we have at least 3 iterations of this letter, probably from late 2011 through sometime in 2013 when he was captured. All right, so the very first letter says, "Dear sir, I'm in place. I've got some people. We're setting up a group in Libya to get weapons for us. They're really expensive. We're asking our guys over in the peninsula," and he specifically names Wuheshi, to give us money so we're able to afford the equipment that we're then shipping over to the Sinai, where we're setting up training camps. So that's the first letter. The second letter says, "Dear sir, we have a well-established group in Libya. The sort of supply of weapons is in train. We're, setting up training groups as well in Libya, and we have now trained cadres in the Sinai that are ready to go to war." And the third letter adds to that, by the way, we also have a group in northern Mali, run by an Egyptian, that is going to be carrying out some action in northern Mali. We'll get back to you. Okay, so people suspected there was a linkage between the chaos in Libya and the escalating violence in Mali and in the Sinai. But here we have actually, sort of documentary evidence that this was being purposely pushed by Al-Qaeda and funded by Al-Qaeda in order not just to carry out terrorist attacks, but to train people for guerrilla warfare. So after 2013, there were immediate calls by extremists to declare jihad on the government, the new military government, and to carry out a war against them. And you began seeing more than just terrorist attacks. There was actual guerrilla warfare that was carried out from 2013 on.
Gary Morris, Calhoun, Kentucky. Okay, now comes the difficult question. We have this problem of identifying counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency, and which are insurgents and which are terrorists. How in the end do we try to end both terrorism and insurgency? What things can be done to bring both of them to an end?
Yeah. First, as Aaron said, you have to correctly identify the war you're fighting rather than the war you wish you were fighting. So being able to be truthful about what you're actually confronting is in some ways the most difficult thing. Let me give you an example. Until he left office in 2006, Rumsfeld would not call what was happening in Iraq an insurgency. And nobody in the Pentagon was allowed to use that term. So if you cannot correctly define the problem and call it what it is, you're not going to be able to find the correct solution. Secondly, as Aaron pointed out, a population-centric vision of counterinsurgency really does work. But what it does is it pushes the problem down the spectrum of violence until you're dealing just with terrorism and terrorist groups, and then you can turn it over to these kind of up-armored police forces that then kill and capture the actual terrorists that are left. And that's enemy-centric, right? But once you've gone from having the support of the population to being this kind of isolated, small, unable to recruit group of people who can only carry out terrorist groups, then an enemy-centric vision of warfare or of law enforcement will actually work. So the purpose of counterinsurgency is to suppress the level of violence down to where it becomes a domestic law enforcement issue. I do not expect that Al-Qaeda will simply one day say, we surrender, and give it up. It hasn't happened in every other insurgency known to mankind. It's just not usually the way it goes. Let me give you some examples of this. The Malayan emergency is usually pointed to as a successful example of counterinsurgency, and rightly so. It pushed the problem down until it became a terrorist problem, and then those guys were one by one hunted down. But in 1968, the guy who had started the original insurgency started it again. And he attempted to ramp up the violence again. And in fact, he wasn't actually convinced to give up the violence until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the level of violence he and the small group that were around him was very low compared to what they had done previously. But it suggests, again, that insurgencies, it's not a simple matter of, they're all dead, they're all captured, there's no violence at all, the end of the war. It just sort of trickles down to as low as possible, and then you treat it like crime. And you get the military out, and you let the police deal with it.
Rachel Henricks, Bishop Ireton High School, Alexandria, Virginia. I'm interested in what you were saying about Russia with the success of counterinsurgency that they used, success quotes, right? Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Right, so it's, I like to call it the Roman method of counterinsurgency. So as Aaron pointed out, the term counterinsurgency just means everything that you do in order to suppress an insurgency. And some of those things are successful, and some of them are wildly unsuccessful. The use of this kind of violence is completely unsupported either by international law, by our own innate moral sense, or by reason, because it creates, in some cases, lasting hatreds that come back to haunt you 100 years later. I'll give you an example from the Roman period. The Romans used precisely the same kind of technique, which is go in and wipe out the whole village, which means the other villages decide to run for it because they don't want to be killed. And you have a targeted population, and you simply wipe out as many as you need to until the rest of them leave. That's the Russian method of counterinsurgency, if one wants to call it that, right? The Romans did basically the same thing to a targeted population that had started an insurgency back in about 200 AD. And they had found this very clever way of hiding by digging tunnels so that they could, carry on life without being seen, and then they'd pop up behind your lines and carry out attacks and then go back in the tunnels and so on and so forth. And it was so expensive to deal with this insurgency that they never held a victory parade for it, which the Romans always did, because they got no booty from it, spoils from it. So they were like, forget that, And they lost entire legions, which was unheard of in Roman warfare. When they had finally killed off 2/3 of the population, they pushed the other third out of the territory and forbade them from ever settling there again. 1,800 years later, the Israelis, the descendants of those who'd been pushed out like that, came back and started a new country called Israel. So did they win? In a historian sense, no. In the sense of the existence of the Roman Empire, yes. We're currently engaged in a 400-year insurgency with the Irish. The British are currently engaged in a 800-year insurgency with the Irish. 800-year insurgency that has had 50-year gaps every once in a while. There's currently a gap. As a historian, I don't think it's over. Yeah.
Richard Van Bosch, Modesto, California. And my question has to do with the use of drones. And I was interested in your opinion on the use of drones and its effect on radicalizing insurgents and hampering efforts that we may have with foreign nations if we violate international space.
Yeah, drones are used as one of the active recruitment methods by Al-Qaeda, specifically. They bring up the civilians who were killed, or they say were killed, the damage that is done to the environment, to villages, as one of the reasons that the Americans are fighting a barbaric war. So it is one of the methodologies, or one of the things that they're using in order to carry out active recruitment. In addition, if you're not dealing with a terrorism problem, it will make absolutely no difference in the fight. So the United States has been using this to kill off leadership, and what we've actually done is created better and better leadership and smarter leadership for Al-Qaeda. They also changed their entire organizational structure in order to be more resilient. So one of the reasons that the decapitation attempt in Abbottabad failed was because they had 2 deputies and not 1. And the reason they had 2 deputies was as a direct result of drones. Their response was, we're going to create more resilience. And they've also been training up entire cadres of leadership behind them as sort of your replacement if a drone gets you. So we can tell this is working by the fact that after the death of bin Laden, only one group, ISIS, chose to splinter from Al-Qaeda. And there were lots of claims the entire thing was going to fracture into 1 million pieces. That's one. And 2, by the fact that the level of violence carried out by Al-Qaeda has escalated rather than de-escalated since we attempted this decapitation strike. And 3, 40 days, which is the traditional period of mourning after bin Laden's death, they held some sort of ceremony in some place. It was reported in the Pakistani press in which dozens of groups lined up and swore an oath of Bayat to Zawahiri. And there was no change in the operational tempo, as far as we can tell, of Al-Qaeda. because of this. So, my opinion, for this particular conflict, it should be one of the tools that's used, but cannot be what we depend upon in order to end it.
From Washington, D.C. I just wondered, Northern Ireland's come up a couple of times this morning, and I wondered to what extent do you think the British were successful in putting down that insurgency, and to what extent did diplomacy sort of take over and bring the lull, as you say?
Gosh, that's a really good question. As you can tell from what I just said, I don't believe that this is a final settlement to the violence there, and I do believe it's going to come back as an issue, unless Britain is willing to cede entirely any sort of influence, control, whatever in Ireland, and allow the creation of a unified Ireland. I think it's going to come back as a problem in a decade or two. At the same time, in ending this particular piece of violence, the British tried a whole series, actually, of kind of law enforcement and military techniques, and did find a set of them that lessened the urban violence tremendously, and that hardened targets and prevented terrorist attacks by splinter pieces of the IRA on England and elsewhere. So in that sense, in saving lives and lessening violence, that did have an effect. But the final settlement was entirely dependent upon coming to some negotiated political settlement. And that's what really led to the final end. But by making it impossible for you to achieve your goals through violence, they made it clear that this is going to happen through talking rather than through war. Any other questions?
Mary, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
You mentioned very quickly, without actually any elaboration, that the intellectual guide for Al-Qaeda is Chairman Mao. Might you elaborate on that connection?
No. So, yes, so the problem is that we tend to think of Al-Qaeda and ISIS as the Amish, with a lot of violence. Please. Right? If the Amish were not pacifists. But in fact, in the 19th century, the founders of reformist Islam made a distinction between what they called civilizational objects and cultural objects. Civilizational objects were things that were inherent to the religion of Islam and could not be compromised on. It included things like the Quran, like the Sharia, however defined, and lots of other things like this. The notion that there's only one God, and so on. Cultural objects were things like techniques that you might use in doing ordinary life, and they were very pragmatic about it. They talked about educational techniques, they talked about technological techniques, and they talked about military techniques. It was perfectly reasonable to them to separate those two things and say, one, you cannot copy from the infidels, and the other one, you're absolutely allowed to copy from the infidels. So Mao apparently, as far as I can tell, from the documents we have captured in Afghanistan in 2002, was introduced to Al-Qaeda through a guy who was trained at Fort Bragg. Named Ali Mohammed. He was in the Egyptian military, and he'd been sent on an educational exchange to be trained. Here you go, training somebody in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, gone badly awry. So he went back, apparently, and set up an entire training regimen that we've captured, that was based blatantly on Mao. Not only that, but we have captured statements and documents that specifically say Mao and Jop. So we don't have to guess about this.
If there are any other questions? Jen? Okay, one last question.
Jennifer Jolly from Melbourne, Florida. It's okay. I actually, that was my question, and I think you may have already answered it, but out of those hundreds of thousands of, documents and terabytes of information that were captured, what was gleaned? And that was really my question.
What was the?
What was gleaned
Oh, what was
from
gleaned.
that particular package of information? Yeah.
So there's actually 3 separate things that I've been talking about. One of them is captured documents from Afghanistan and Iraq. So in 2002, when U.S. military forces went into Afghanistan, we know that al-Qaeda was not ready for the U.S. to invade boots on the ground by the fact that they left everything behind, including all of their documents and hard drives and stuff. And that was apparently a treasure trove of information, certainly was to me. And that is available for some place called the CRRC, the Center for Recovered something or other. Shouldn't have started down that line, should I? CRRC. They were forced because of sequestration to close their doors, by the way. So if you guys have any poll in Washington, those of you from Washington. But I worked in those archives, so I know the sorts of documents that they have there. And then from Iraq, there were millions of documents that were captured, and a lot of those are also available for people to use. So we have these huge collections of documents. And then the third collection is from Abbottabad. And hundreds of those were released in English before 2017. So we have hundreds of documents freely available on the DNI website. You can go to the DNI website. But in November, just November of 2017, the CIA, who apparently had ownership of these documents now, released hundreds of thousands of documents in Arabic. And I'm still going through those. So what I've gleaned from it is that they're very smart. They're very resilient. They're a learning organization, and we shouldn't take them lightly. That's number one. Number two, that they have a planning function that has created elaborate doctrines, but these then have operational plans leading off of them. And we've captured probably half a dozen of these operational plans, everywhere from Mali to Egypt to Yemen, lots of different places. And they take the doctrine and implement it for this specific situation. So they're very interested in the opposite of what we think. We think they want to create chaos and violence, but they are in fact very intentional in what they're doing. The third thing you learn is they're planning for the long term. They talk all the time about generational, about 200 years. And they don't mind having setbacks. As with Mao and Job, they talk all the time about step back, go back a stage, wait around till they get tired, and then come back again. And we've seen that happen dozens of times around the world. So right now in Indonesia, there is an extremist problem, probably to rival that before Densus 88 was created. So despite the success against what we all think of as a terrorist group, they've managed to recreate themselves.